Okay, we're going to start. This is the last of our series of research conversations for this year, so thank you all very much for coming. I will just tell you who we have today. We have two presentations. As normal, we have beginning with Luigi Prada, who is the Lady Wallace Budge JRF at UNIV, who did his doctorate here in Oriental Studies. He will be in conversation with his former supervisor about a corpus of dream interpretation books from ancient Egypt. And I won't introduce Mark Smith because I think most of you should know who he is. So what we'll do is go till about 1:30, and at 1:30 we'll do a quick transform. We'll do a quick transfer over a slight move geographically to Syria and an enormous leap chronologically, about 2,000 years. So please.
Well, Luigi, I'd like to start by asking how you got interested in dream interpretation. What gave you the idea to study this type of material? I hope you're not going to tell me that the idea came to you in a dream.
Well, I think I like to give that answer, but the truth is slightly more prosaic. So actually I almost accidentally stumbled on the topic. The reason being that already at the time of my master's I wanted to work on unpublished material. It so happens that a lot of the textual material from the later phases of ancient Egypt history that I focus on is actually still untouched and under-researched. And the papyrus, specifically in the Berlin Museum that I started working on, just turned out to be a fragment of a dream book. And then I just decided that I wanted more, and that became a doctoral dissertation and went on and on.
And how do we know about dreams in ancient Egypt? I think many of us think of dreams as fairly private things. We only tell them to members of our family or friends. So how do we know what ancient Egyptians dreamed about thousands of years ago?
Well, there's plenty of sources of many different types. It tends to be textual material. The archaeological material. It's more infrequent. But in terms of texts, we actually have a huge corpus and different types of material, including scientific literature. I call it scientific because that's how the ancient Egyptians thought of it. These dream books are actually very similar in their phrasing, in the style, to medical texts. And we also have plenty of evidence from daily life. So documents that could be letters, for instance, simple accounts and notes that, again, a couple of jottings recording the content of a dream. But then we also have much more official types of texts, including royal texts and stele, where kings record divine epiphanies that they experienced in their sleep. And then, of course, in that type of text, the question is whether we're actually talking about real dreams or it's pure propaganda. But I guess that's a different matter.
Do we have dreams from all periods of Egyptian history, would you say? Or?
We have records for dreams from most of ancient Egypt's history. However, most of the material is actually quite late in date. The type of scientific literature on dream interpretation that I mentioned actually starts, as far as the evidence tells us now, with the New Kingdom, so the second half of the second millennium BC, and then it goes down until the end of Egyptian culture in the Roman period, the first centuries of the Common Era. In a way, yes. I actually, in terms of dream interpretation itself, I would say that's the branch of divination that has the longest history of attestation, at least a millennium and a half in ancient Egypt.
Mm. And an obvious question, I suppose, is what did ancient Egyptians dream about? Are there any characteristic types of dream that you find in ancient Egypt that are greatly different to the ones that people have today?
Well, it's a mixed bag, I guess. They dreamt pretty much of everything that they could experience in real life in their waking state. So pretty much like us, I would imagine. There are, of course, dreams that are just culturally characterizing Egyptian dream interpretation. I mean, one obvious example would be a lot of Egyptian gods appearing in these dreams, or even animals with sacred associations. In a way, funnily enough, much of the previous scholarly literature has focused as so like cherry-picked topics that were perhaps of more interested to the modern scholar or even to the modern readership, such as dreams of sexual content. Those were always incredibly popular, and we find actually a lot of scholarly articles that focus on that and actually don't pay as much attention to other topics. I guess understandably so. It works also for research grants, I think.
So they're popular among Egyptologists, but not so popular among ancient Egyptians.
Yes, I found out that that's actually a danger of this type of scholarly research, because sometimes this type of academic study might say more about the researcher rather than about the object of research.
Yeah. Could you give an example, just so people who haven't read these texts can gain an idea of what a typical statement about the interpretation of a dream might be from one of these?
Yeah, they
texts?
tend. Well, these texts tend to be quite. In a way, the interpretation of a dream tends to be quite short, because, of course, like the vaguer, the more relevant to the life of any given person they will be. Kind of like. Fortune cookies, I suppose, with your meal. But in the specific, in these dream books, we have, first of all, the typical Egyptian dream book, in order to be user-friendly, divides dreams based on topics. So we have different chapters. One chapter would be about dreams where gods appear, another one about more trivial dreams, where somebody dreams of plants or even trees. And then within each chapter, almost every single line just contains one dream, so one dream per line. First half of the line will have a very short dream description, not in a narrative fashion, but really just mentioning the thematic core. So if somebody dreams of being on top of a sycamore tree, and then the second half of the line will give also rather generic prediction, more or less just in terms of whether it's an ominous dream or an auspicious dream, and again the type of consequences that this could be. So often they discuss matters of inheritance or matrimonial matters, or even matters of power and influence in the local community.
And when you see these dreams, well, if you dream about this or that, for example, being on a sycamore tree, is it ever possible to connect the nature of the dream and the outcome?
Yes, there is actually a rationale. So dreams and predictions are not connected at random, although sometimes we do struggle as modern interpreters in trying to see this connection. The connection can be just, let's say, thematic, based on the content of the dream, and then the topic of the predictions and what the prediction focuses on. So let's say it can be based on analogy. So a dream where somebody acquires something in the dream and then might actually translate in somebody acquiring something in their life. It can also be more counterintuitively actually based on contrast. So what we would call a nightmare, so a dream that has thematically so like unpleasant topic, may actually also have a very positive outcome in real life. But then perhaps the more complex type of connections are those based on punning and on wordplay. To give you an example, we have this text from around 1200 BC, and one dream is about this man dreaming of eating flesh of a donkey. That's just the dream description. If a man sees himself in a dream eating flesh of a donkey, and the prediction says this is a good dream, it means that he will become more powerful, become more important, in a way actually would be promoted, we could translate it. And this seems quite random to us, but the but the connection is actually there when we look at the original Egyptian, because the word for donkey in Egyptian is just onomatopoeic, And in Egyptian we also have this verb, which is etymologically unconnected, but it just so happens to be very similar phonetically. And that's also the verb a'a, which means to be great or to become great. So in that case, that's all down to the panel, I should say.
We're going to be looking for a new faculty board chair in about a year, so if any of you have a dream about a dog, do get in touch. So do these dreams, do you think, tell us anything about the ancient Egyptians?
They
the
do.
Content and the predictions?
Yes, they do. So interestingly enough, when I first started my research, I thought that all these dream descriptions, and again they come in their hundreds, and when I put together the whole corpus, thousands, I thought that all these could give us a fantastic, like catalog of the Egyptian psyche, and in a way they do, of course. However, what I didn't think much of at first, and actually I completely changed my view on that, was the importance, the equal importance of the predictions, because the predictions have nothing to do again with directly with the description of the Egyptian psychology. However, they actually reveal very clearly what the desires, the wishes, and the fears of these people were, because we often say a lot about ancient Egyptian texts that they don't necessarily give. And that applies to other ancient Near Eastern civilizations. They don't necessarily give an overview of the whole society, because it's of course something that comes from the elite. I mean, literacy in those times and in those lands was very limited. However, in the case of this text, indeed, it was still a very small portion of society that could read these texts, but these texts were used for people who, of course, did not have direct access to them, but used the services of dream interpreters. And so the hopes and the fears described in them are, in a way, you could say, more of those of the common people. They're not just about Pharaoh and the royal court.
What would you say are some of the main preoccupations that these outcomes reveal?
The ancient Egyptians seem to be very material people, so very, very rational in a way. So the main preoccupation is always about property and money. I mean, money. In Greco-Roman society, we can actually also talk about money in the later centuries of ancient Egypt. And also a lot about legal problems. We know that also especially in these later times, the society was very litigious in a way, where we have a lot of legal acts and proceedings from trials. And much of it is also about, again, making sure to end up in a good marriage. And again, dreamers can be both, we can see things both from a female perspective and also from a man's perspective, because these dream books, I should also say, they cater for different types of dreamers. So there are dream books that are for female dreamers, and there are dream books actually for male dreamers. And the same dream can actually have a completely different value depending on whether it's been dreamt by a woman or a man, and also by the social status of this person and their life conditions. So for instance, I'll give again another example, and this is a favorite of previous scholarship because it's not a sexual dream. It's a dream about a woman. So it's a woman dreaming of having sex with a snake, and the prediction is as a dual value. So the text says if she's not married, this is a very good dream. It means that she will get married very soon. And also, I suppose that the Freudian image there is quite clear. However, if she happens to already be married, this is a terrible dream, and it means that she will fall ill. She will fall seriously ill soon, and she may even die. And again, this being, of course, the connection that she shouldn't really be dreaming of sleeping with snakes if she's already married.
Let's talk a little bit about the book that you have coming out. Can you say something about the scope of it, what it covers, and what you hope it's going to contribute to our understanding of this subject?
Yes, the book itself is, again, also has a bipartite structure. The first part is the publication of this large corpus of dream interpretation handbooks from ancient Egypt. I should say that, again, what was available before I started my research wasn't actually a huge number of dream books, but because generally of the neglect that this textual material has suffered from, the unpublished material was like 3 times as much. So what my book will do in its first half is actually to bring all this together, re-edit some of the material that needs reedition, and offer the first edition of all these new texts. And the second half instead is the one that will be, that hopefully, that I intend to make completely accessible also to non-philologists who actually have Egyptological skills, because and that other half will be the discussion of the type of knowledge that we gain from all this in terms of ancient Egyptian society through the centuries, from the end of the 2nd millennium BC down to the Greco-Roman period, connections with other Mediterranean civilizations, be that again Mesopotamian civilizations first and later on with the Greeks and the Romans, and also once again like a study of the type of like psychology behind these texts. So that is the design of the book.
You mentioned that you've discovered a lot of new texts, and I think this is one of the really interesting things I've found about your research, because for a long time people writing about dream interpretation in ancient Egypt have focused on 1 or 2 texts, which are always cited over and over again, but it's remarkable the number of new ones that you have found in various collections, and these are going to be in the book. And do you think they add things? Can you think of maybe one particular thing that these new texts you've discovered add that we didn't know before?
Yes, they do add a lot. Well, for instance, I simply like come across the fragments, because we also talk in most cases of a lot of like these very badly preserved fragments of papyrus. Come across fragments of the earliest demotic dream book. I should specify what demotic is. Demotic is a late phase of the ancient Egyptian language, and also the script in which this is written, starting from the 7th century BC thereabouts. And so we do have just a couple of ancient Egyptian dream books written in earlier phases of the Egyptian language and script from the end of the 2nd millennium BC and early 1st millennium BC. But then 80 to 90% of the material is actually in demotic. So amongst the things that I come across browsing collections are the first fragments of demotic dream book. And interestingly enough, actually this very fragment happens to be another fragment concerning dreams of sexual content, which also defies so like previous conclusions of scholarship that just happen to know dream books discussing sexual dreams for a female dreamer, and had actually created type of speculations that dreams of sexual content, because of matters of decorum, or sometimes even matters of different treatment of men and women in ancient Egyptian society, were something only attached to female dreamers. However, this very early fragment happens to be about sexual dreams experienced by men. So in a way, again, that sort of like changes the game.
You mentioned that a lot of these texts date from a period when Greeks had settled in Egypt in large numbers, and there was a lot of interaction between Greeks and Egyptians. And I'm just wondering, is this ever reflected in the traditions relating to dream interpretation that we find among Greeks and Egyptians at this time?
It is, interestingly enough. It is not that clearly reflected, and it might just be completely absent from the scientific literature itself. So these dream interpretation handbooks, which were, in the Egyptian case, traditionally preserved in temple libraries, and they seem to have been like quite close to influences from the Greeks in the later centuries. On the other hand, daily life material related to dreams shows this type of interaction and how full there was in daily life. We have, for instance, a papyrus in Cairo containing a letter, which is written half of it is in Greek. It's a man writing to a friend and updating him about very trivial daily matters. And then at some point he says, "And by the way, last night I had a dream in which you appeared." And so that you may know how, he says literally, he actually says, so that you may know how the gods know you, I shall tell you in detail what the content of this dream was, but in order to do so, I shall switch to Egyptian. And then he continues the second half of the letter, actually in demotic, so a change of language and a change of script. We have what I would call a shop sign. It looks kind of like a stela, a stone stela, but you can call it a shop sign of a dream interpreter from Egypt, from Saqqara, so not near an area that's now famous because of the presence of pyramids there from earlier times of Egypt's history. And that shop sign is actually by a Greek dream interpreter, and he actually proudly professes his ethnicity. He says, I interpret dreams as so a task given to me by the god, and I come from Crete, of all places. So, you know, like all this was, at the time Egypt, as you said, was a multicultural and multilingual society, and so every type of service, including, in this case, divination, dream interpretation, had to cater for this, at least like these two types of public, and that meant that we do have interaction. We see that, although perhaps not just at the highest level of this type of dream books, so like special production.
And obviously dream interpretation is only one type of divination that we find in Egypt at this time. There are various other ways of trying to predict what's going to happen. How do you see dream interpretation fitting into this larger system of practices intended to reveal what's going to happen?
Well, as you said, yes, divination in ancient Egypt is attested in many different forms, many branches. The ancient Greeks, the historian Herodotus considered Egypt as a cradle of many aspects of civilization, including divination itself. As I think I mentioned before, dream interpretation appears to be the divinatory art with the longest history of attestation, at least in our eyes, you know, depending what has come down to us in terms of the evidence that survived. But we do have many other branches of divination, such as, well, astrology, for instance, that in Greek-Roman times was as popular, from what we can conclude, again, based on the number of manuscripts, for instance, that have survived, was as popular as dream interpretation. And we have even other very interesting branches of divination that that we have only recently come across, again, because of this renaissance in late Egyptian textual studies. So we have animal omina, or terrestrial omina also called, that would be very with which Assyriologists will be very familiar. So these describe, for instance, behaviors of animals and also contacts between animals and a human observer. And based on this, they predict things about the future of the human observer. In a way, again, this is be like trivializing it, but just to give you an idea, it is not that far from our superstition about, like, you know, like a black cat crossing the road. Granted that for us that's superstition and that's just a negative thing. These animal omina, of course, were in the Egyptians' eyes were a completely different cultural phenomenon, and also they could be equally auspicious or ominous, like in the case of any other type of divinatory science. We have brontoscopy, so again the study of meteorological phenomena, again to tell things about the future, specifically brontoscopy based on thunder, and many other, lecanomancy, that's the study of the shape that an oil stain can assume while floating on water, so just pouring a little oil on water and then studying the shape of it and again coming to conclusions. I should say that all this again was not based on random ideas of some, you know, like random interpreters, like lunatics, but they were actually, again, was again a scientific knowledge, a scientific art that was written down in handbooks that were copied over generations and centuries.
Okay. So I'll finish with one last question. I'm sure other people would like to ask questions, but I'm wondering, after so many years of studying these dream books, are your dreams ever influenced by ancient Egyptian ones? Do you ever dream about crocodiles, or that you're in a sycamore tree? Or both?
Well, I think that's censored. Yeah. It's too early in the day. Well, I think the one time that ancient Egyptian dreams did influence my dreams, I believe that was the night before my DPhil viva. So I did dream of that before my DPhil, and but in general, I don't tend to remember my own dreams. I guess that's why I had to study somebody else's dreams.
Okay. Can I ask a question? In a Syrian text, as you probably know from Nimrud of the late 8th or early 7th century, we have Egyptian dream interpreters at the Assyrian court. And I've always wondered why, at that particular period, when they have their own dream science, as you might call it, they have bothered to import some Egyptian experts for that particular thing.
That's a very good question, and that's something that I wonder myself, especially because you also see like contrasting theories in the literature where again like, people believe in a very strong influence of Assyrian dream interpretation on the Egyptian side or the other way around. My personal opinion is that actually they are relatively independent traditions in terms as far as dream interpretation go. That's not true for other branches of divination, but as far as I believe. In terms of the popularity of dream interpreter, even whose presence is also tested in Assyria, well, that seems to me like that came together with the type of renown and authority that Egyptian culture in general seems to have had, even with its other ancient important neighbors. If we look at text also from even as early as the New Kingdom, so again I'm talking in this case around 1300 BC, we have this text, the Amarna letters. So this is international diplomacy records that were found in Egypt, but were written in Akkadian and in cuneiform because that was the English, the diplomatic language of the time. And in this text there is at least one letter, there may be more, but there is one letter that I remember sent by the king of Alashia, so the king of the land that's now identified as Cyprus, to the Egyptian king, we believe Amenhotep III or the fourth Akhenaton, and he's asking for the Egyptians to send them an interpreter of eagle omens, which is interesting because in terms, for instance, of these animal terrestrial omina in Egypt, they're also tested very late. They're not attested in handbooks before the Roman period. And so we always assumed, well, always in these recent years, and now that we know of them, we assumed that they were another Mesopotamian import. However, the presence in 1300 BC of a Middle Eastern ruler actually asking for the Egyptian king to send an Egyptian eagle interpreter, which in a way is an animal omina interpreter, in a way also sheds more light and makes all the question like more problematic and more interesting. So yes, I believe that the Egyptian culture, including divination-wise, had a heavy weight even in the Near East, and then even more so with classical civilizations. I mean, the Greeks have wrote whole dream interpretation handbooks pretending as a matter of fact that they were translations from Egyptian text while they had nothing to do with them. Yeah. And then of course we can think of the Bible, so the story of Joseph, and so we see a lot of influence of this reputation of Egyptian divination in the Eastern Mediterranean as a whole over the centuries.
Well, thank you. You did a very good job of demystifying this subject for us. In a way it seems a pity, I'm a bit disappointed. But I guess also in the nature of the sources you're looking at, most of the dreams that you've discussed are very impersonal, they're very generic. But are there also dream descriptions that are more personal, that are more reflective of an individual's consciousness or personality, or dreams associated with guilt or very specific aspirations? Or is it really rather, in the way you described, sort of codified into sets of dreams that are very simple to interpret?
Well, again, the codification happens to be in the scientific literature, but the documents of daily life, they can be incredibly personal. So yes, we do actually get in contact with real individuals through that, and we do actually get access to their dreams, to their actual specific dreams that they dreamt on a specific night. We have several archives. One that Mark, for instance, has dealt with an Egyptian priest from 2nd century BC, Memphis, a very important city in Egypt. The archive of Horus of Sebennytos. He was an Egyptian priest, and he recorded a lot of his own dreams. And there is nothing exceptional. Again, we have plenty of records of many other people. In some cases, people who, like this priest, were, in a way, like learned, and at least they were literate, which again is not a negligible thing in ancient Egypt, neglectable thing in ancient Egypt. And And in the case of other people, well, they actually have records that may be written by the village scribe, so that then they could have been submitted to a priest who is also a dream interpreter. In other cases, we know of people reporting their dreams to a temple oracle. So yes, we do get access to very personal dreams and very specific things.
This man, Hor, is an interesting case in point if you want guilt. Because he apparently was employed in a cult and they kept sacred ibises in the temple, and he was responsible for the food of these ibises, except he asked someone else to look after it, and the food underwent what he refers to as a million destructions. And he clearly felt guilty about this because he records a dream he had in which a god appears to him and says, I gave you enough food for 160,000 ibises. Can you hand it over now?
Oh, no.
He doesn't have it anymore. So he has some really striking dreams where you see anxiety about things that he thinks he's failed to do in his daily life.
Okay, I think we're going to have to finish that. So let's say thank you very much, Luigi. Thank you.